The strawberry leaf tiara was designed and commissioned in 1861 by the husband and consort of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, as a wedding gift for their third child and second daughter, Princess Alice, who was soon to be married to the Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine, Louis IV. The stunning diamond tiara was composed of a rich bandeau with foliage, strawberry leaves, and spires. It's not to be confused with a very similar but different strawberry leaf tiara that was also designed and commissioned by Prince Albert but for Queen Victoria. Prince Albert would never get to give his new strawberry leaf tiara to his daughter, because in between the time of the engagement and marriage, he would die of what was diagnosed as typhoid fever. This was a devastating blow to the family, especially to Queen Victoria, who had been madly in love with her husband since the day she met him. Nearly 7 months later, Princess Alice and the Grand Duke were married in the dining room of Osborne House. The bride wore white, while everyone else in attendance wore black, still in mourning of Albert's death. Queen Victoria sat in an armchair being shielded by her sons, so that no one could see her tears. The Queen would later describe the wedding to her eldest daughter as more of a funeral than a wedding, and the saddest day she could remember. The tiara was finally gifted to Princess Alice, but it was bittersweet. Let's fast forward 10 years later, and Alice and the Grand Duke now have 6 children. Their second youngest at the time, 2-year-old Prince Friedrich, was playing with his 4-year-old brother Prince Ernest in their mother's bedroom at New Palace. While Ernest stayed in their mother's bedroom, Friedrich ran to another room that had a window so that someone in Alice's room could also see someone who was in the other room and vice versa. Below this window was about a 20-foot drop, and Friedrich climbed onto a chair and peered out of the window so that he could look at his brother. Now, when Alice saw this happening, she ran towards him to get him away from the window, but while she was doing so, the chair tipped over and Friedrich fell out of the window down 20 feet and onto a baluster. Friedrich miraculously survived this fall and probably would have been fine if it wasn't for his hemophilia. If you do not know what hemophilia is, it is an inherited genetic disorder that seems to only be carried by women but only affects men, and it impairs the body's ability to make blood clots. This results in people who have it suffering from easy bruising and an increased and prolonged bleeding, and oftentimes bleeding inside the joints and the brain. This disorder was prominent in European royalty in the 19th and 20th centuries, and seems to have started with Queen Victoria, who passed it on to her daughters, who then passed it on to many of their descendants, Prince Friedrich just being one of many. He died of a brain hemorrhage just hours after the fall. Princess Alice never forgot her youngest son, celebrating anniversaries of his milestones, such as his first steps, even years after he died. 5 years later, all but one of Alice's children, including a daughter, Princess Marie, who was born a year after Prince Friedrich died, all caught diphtheria, which is an infection that causes patches to develop in the throat and block the airway, which can result in the patient choking to death, especially in the 19th century when there was little to no treatment. Despite the risk to her own life, Alice nursed her children herself, even kissing them to bring them comfort. But on the morning of November 16th, Alice was awakened by doctors informing her that something was gravely wrong with her youngest child, Marie. And by the time Alice made it to her daughter's bedroom, 4-year-old Marie was already dead. Alice sat at her daughter's bedside, distraught, wondering how she was going to tell her husband that their baby was gone. Alice didn't tell her other children of their sister's death until December. The weeks in between, they would ask how Marie was doing and even offer to send her toys so that she would have something to play with. Not long after telling her children, Alice too would begin to feel the symptoms of the infection. On December 14th, the 17th anniversary of her father's death, Alice died aged 35. Her last words were reportedly, "Dear Papa." In her tomb exhibits herself sleeping peacefully, holding her youngest baby in her arms. After Alice's death, the strawberry leaf tiara was inherited by her only living son, Prince Ernest. In 1894, 26-year-old Ernest gifted his new bride, Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the tiara. In 1896, Victoria wore the tiara to the coronation of Nicholas II and Alex of Hesse, where 1,282 people were crushed to death in a crowd rush. Nicholas and Alex's reign would also be plagued with tragedy. Ernest and Victoria proved to be very incompatible, but despite that, not even a year after their wedding, Victoria gave birth to their first child and daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who they affectionately called Ella. Their mutual love for their daughter would not bring them together, as Ernest and Victoria were reported to fight constantly, with Victoria even throwing things at Ernest and making accusations that he was sleeping with a male servant. Victoria would discover that she was pregnant again 4 years later, but unfortunately she would give birth to a stillborn son, and the next year Ernest and Victoria would divorce. They shared custody of their only child, Elizabeth, who would spend 6 months with one parent and the other 6 months with the other parent. Elizabeth preferred to be with her father, however, and didn't believe that her mother truly loved her. While visiting her imperial cousins in Germany, Elizabeth caught and died from typhoid fever at just 8 years old, and Victoria would receive the news as she was on her way to be at her sick daughter's bedside. Ernest would write about his daughter 30 years after her death in his memoirs. "My little Elizabeth was the sunshine of my life." After Ernest and Victoria had divorced, she returned to him the strawberry leaf tiara that he had gifted her 7 years earlier. Almost 2 years after Elizabeth's death, Ernest remarried to Eleanor Soames Holmes Soames Litch, and naturally the tiara was given to her. Now, let's take a big time jump here. 32 years later, in 1937, Ernest had just recently passed away, and Eleanor was flying from Munich, Germany to London, England, with her and Ernest's oldest son, George, and his pregnant wife, Cecily, and 2 of their 3 young children for the wedding of her and Ernest's youngest son, Louis. During the flight, they came across bad weather, and the plane hit the chimney of a brick factory, crashed, and burst into flames. All the crew, Eleanor, George, Cecily, and their children, born and unborn, died along with the other passengers who were flying with them. Upon the wreck site, they discovered the remains of a male newborn infant, and an inquiry into the crash discovered Cecily had given birth during the flight, and the pilot had attempted to land the plane despite the poor weather conditions, therefore causing the crash. After receiving news of his family's death, the wedding of Louis to his wife Margaret was moved to the immediate day after, instead of 4 days later as was planned. After the wedding, Louis and Margaret went to the site of the crash, where the family's belongings were collected. Among those belongings was a box, containing inside of it none other than the strawberry leaf tiara, completely unscathed, the same as it was when it was made 76 years before. No one has been seen wearing the tiara after all these years, and now it belongs to the foundation of the House of Hesse, tightly locked away, only being exhibited rarely, and most likely never to be worn again.